Okay. Our guest today is software entrepreneur Mark Kasdorf. Mark is the CEO and founder of Intrepid Pursuits. Intrepid Pursuits is a Cambridge-based mobile development company building native iOS and Android apps. In its first 3 years, Intrepid grew from 2 to 25 people and has built 50 apps for a variety of companies, ranging from Fortune 500s to startup companies. Mark acts as the CEO of Timbre, a live music discovery app, which has spun out of Intrepid Pursuits into its own entity. He also serves as a TechStars mentor. I encourage you to look into TechStars, which is an interesting topic that we may have a moment to discuss today as well. Additionally, Mark is the founder of Intrepid Labs, a co-working space in the heart of Kendall Square, catering to growing businesses of 5 to 25 employees. Over 20 companies call Intrepid Labs home in over 1,100 square feet. So we'll have a number of interesting things to talk about with our guest, Mark Kasdorf. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mark Kasdorf. That was a great intro. I'm going to get to a little bit more of my background, but I'm kind of going to dive in because I inserted that in the middle of the presentation for some reason. So first, a quick note on the presentation. The slides don't really build on each other. There's not a whole lot of cohesiveness. There are a bunch of thoughts that I thought were interesting with a bunch of stories tied to them, and then I'll chat with George. So just don't expect lots of continuity. First, my prep, because I thought this was kind of relevant. So I agreed to do this lecture about 6 weeks ago and then promptly completely forgot about it. And then Saturday night, my assistant had put a notification that blinged at me at 6 p.m. that said, hey, you're giving a presentation Monday. You'd better prep for it. And I dug back through emails, and I read the course description, which I found online, and I read that email, and that's it. I watched a grand total of 10 minutes of video across 3 of the videos that were posted from last year. So I don't know if this will be similar to other presentations or not, but it was a bunch of stuff that I thought was interesting. The last reason I did this slide the way I did it, who here has heard of the 10-20-30 rule of presentations? So 10-20-30 rule, this is one of those anecdotes that will pop up all over the place in this talk. This is the worst slide anyone has ever put up on a screen in front of you guys. So 10-20-30 rule says that any presentation, really business plans is what the rule is towards, but really almost any presentation ought to be able to be done in 10 slides, 20 minutes, and nothing less than size 30 font. Kawasari, the guy that invested in Apple back in the early 80s, gave this presentation where he said if you need an algorithm to determine the minimum font size that you ought to have on the screen, take the oldest person in the audience, divide their age by 2, and that's the biggest font size you ought to have in any presentation. So if you're giving a presentation to 16-year-olds, go with the size 8. Otherwise, your words are for what you're not going to say, and pictures are for what you are saying, so don't have a ton of words in a presentation. So next, a quick kind of prologue / disclaimer. Number 1, I am not a designer in any sense of the word. At best, I'm a client. At worst, I'm a hindrance to design processes. But I have an interesting perspective, and as I kind of define designer a little bit later, you might be able to call me a designer in some senses of the word. Second, I can't, and this is part of the disclaimer, I can't tell the difference between Times New Roman and Helvetica. Just not my thing. But I do hire quite a few designers, and I think a lot about design. And I don't want to overstate the fact that I'm not a designer. I spent a lot of time thinking about what Apple's new flat paradigm meant versus skeuomorphic, and I understand some design concepts, and I think about it quite a bit, even though I can't do anything. This presentation, the one I sent to George last night, was all just black and white bullets and text, and I handed it over to a designer to say, hey, can we make this look good for tomorrow? So now me. I went to law school, incidentally, it's up here, and I took a class at the School of Management, and they had a guest speaker just like this, and he had this exact slide, and I actually thought it was incredibly useful as I was like thinking about my future, so I made one of my own. So the top, where is it? Oh, she didn't do it. Okay, no matter. The stuff on the bottom is academic and professional, and the stuff on the top is the stuff that matters. And one of the takeaways I'd love for you guys to take with us as you get ready to start a professional career is that the stuff on the top really, really matters. So quick kind of my life. I'm 29. I'm probably a little younger than most of your speakers. I started college in late 2002, just after I started dating my now wife. I decided to major in mathematics halfway through my sophomore year. I spent a year in Oxford in 2005 studying mathematics, where I decided not to get a PhD in math because it's really hard and there were people a whole lot smarter than I am there. I decided to go to law school at the end of 2006, got engaged just before starting law school. In 2007, we got married. In 2008, I bought my first house, which actually leads to how I started my first company. So the first company I started was a company called Burning Hollow Technologies. It was in the home automation and energy management space. And my wife and I had this opportunity to purchase this gut rehab out in Wayland, Massachusetts. Really nice town, but we basically bought a slab foundation, 4 walls, and a roof. And there was nothing else. We had to gut the whole thing. We did it ourselves during my second and third year law school. It was an absolute blast of a time. But as I stood in this cavernous house, I realized that there was this amazing opportunity to include technology in the house because I had all the walls open and there was never going to be a better time. And Zigbee and Z-Wave and wireless technologies hadn't gotten far enough to the point where today you can automate any house and you don't need to open the walls up at all. But even as recently as 2008, you did need to open up the walls to automate stuff. So I started this company called Burning Hollow Technologies about halfway through my second year of law school. What else there? So this is where kind of the interesting stories begin. So, and I think there's some things mixed up here in terms of where the dashes fall. But in 2009, a bunch of things happened for me. The first was I spent most of my last semester of law school in diligence with VCs. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about VCs in this talk because I don't think it's totally the right audience. But send me an email or something if you're interested in that, because I've spent a lot of time with venture capitalists in Boston. I've raised money a couple times. But I spent a lot of time with VCs. I graduated from law school, and my wife was 6 months pregnant. So the summer after my last semester of law school, I was studying for the bar, raising money for my first company. My wife was 7 months pregnant. We had no money. And I want that to be, like, again, you can, part of, hopefully, one of the takeaways from this talk is you really can do anything when you graduate. You don't need a trust fund. You don't need a head start. You can do anything when you graduate from a school like Northeastern. I was off to the races. I ended up raising a very small angel round, not raising enough money, and in February of 2010, ran out of capital. So we fast forward to February 2010, and I still have no money. My wife is working and not particularly happy about it. It was not part of the life plan for her to be working with a 4-month-old. I was a stay-at-home dad, and I was under pressure to either get a law firm job or find some way to make money. So I started a company called Intrepid Pursuits. At the time, Intrepid was meant to be nothing more than I had 2 amazing developers at Burning Hollow. Intrepid was meant to be nothing more than let's get some food on the table for their families. 2 developers and 1 client later turned into 3 developers and 2 clients, turned into 4 developers and 5 clients. And in August of 2010, I turned down a law firm job offer to make $160,000 a year and started paying myself $50,000 at Intrepid because it was just ready to start paying me a salary. What else? I'm going to kind of skim through this because I don't want to spend the whole time talking about myself. In end of 2011, my son was born, so child number 2, and almost simultaneously I started my second company, which is called Intrepid Labs. Intrepid Labs was a solution to a problem, as most companies should be. The problem was we were a rapidly growing company. We'd gone from 3 to 12 in a year and a half, and we had this problem, which is office space sucks. And I think George might ask me a couple questions about this, but I'll give a quick precursor to office space. And by the way, depending on your kind of bent on design, this is a great area to innovate right now. There's a fundamental mismatch between the needs of a rapidly growing company and the needs of commercial real estate across the world, right? So commercial real estate, I don't want to get too mathy on you, but basically everything is top down in terms of the incentives, right? So the way you make money in commercial real estate is based on your debt terms, right? You don't make money on rent, you make money on debt. It's kind of complicated, but you can look it up on Wikipedia. And so you get better bank terms if you have bigger clients, more space, longer leases, right? A startup needs short leases, very little space, ability to grow, right? Polar opposites. And this trickles all the way down. So the banks need it, so the buildings need it, so the way brokers get paid, which are the people that find you space, is they get paid about $2 times the number of square feet times the year of lease, number of years of the lease, right? So all their incentives are bigger spaces, longer leases. So what I did was I started this place called Intrepid Labs, and Intrepid Labs serves as, probably not many software developers in here, but I call it an abstraction layer between the needs of startups and the needs of big office buildings, right? So what we did is we took a 5-year, 11,000 square foot lease, and we rent out to startups by the desk by the month, which means a startup can grow or shrink, it can let people go, it can leave, and it never has the burdens of a long-term lease. We also get, if you're a 5-person company, now you get to use a $5,000 printer and enterprise class internet and great coffee and great fruit, and all for a price that you can mostly afford. Lastly, Timber. We spun Timber out of Intrepid in late 2012. I really like everyone in the audience to download Timber by the end of the day because that helps us. It's also a super cool app that helps you find live music. It's been featured by Apple 3 times. Time Magazine called it the classiest app they'd ever seen. It's a really good app, and it's a really good case study on well-designed flat apps. Okay, so again, I'm realizing now how much I'm talking about myself, but hopefully George will not ask me about myself. So what am I if I'm not a designer? First, I'm a founder. I found companies. It's all I've ever done. I've never had a job. I think I'm pretty good at it. I really enjoy it. So that's that one. Second, I am a problem solver. And this is really important. I think some definitions of the word design are synonymous with the definition of the word problem solver, right? So I am really good at solving problems. Like if I have 2 fundamental skills, it's selling stuff and solving problems, right? And we're in an age now where you kind of think of the quintessential problem solver, and I think of MacGyver, right? And he solved problems with duct tape and silly string and glue. And problem solvers don't use duct tape anymore. They employ people who use duct tape, and problem solving to me is using human resources and code and great people to solve problems in society. And I'm good at the problem solving thing. Next, I'm a salesman. I cannot overstate for your future how important selling stuff is, right? Every time you go to a job interview, you are selling yourself, right, to that potential employer. And I'll tell you, when I walk into every job interview with a candidate, and I've got their resume, and I've interviewed, 350 people in the 6 years of my career, at least, right? Every time I walk into a job interview, based on their resume, I've got about a 50% range of what I might be willing to pay them, right? And by the end of that very first interview, I've got a 5% range, right? So that first hour, the first hour that you interact, at least at a small company where you're meeting right with the CEO, that first hour you interact, you're determining whether you're going to make 40K or 52K, right? And that's a big difference, and it's all in you. I mean, the 20% range is kind of gated by your resume, but the rest is you selling yourself. How excited are you to work for that company? How excited are you about what they do? How do you present yourself? It's all selling. If you are a designer, so how many people in the audience are not designers by any sense of the word? You're some other major. Okay, that's quite a few. Okay, cool. So this is relevant advice for everyone. But this part's not relevant advice. So the designers in the room, I hate to tell you this, but and I've got a good anecdote later on. 40% of your success as a designer is convincing people after you've already done the design work that it's good, right? Selling your design to clients, selling it to your boss, selling it to your coworkers. And I have a really painful story to share, but it's so true. Next, I'm a risk taker. I think this is nearly genetic, right? Some people are risk takers, some aren't. Quick show of hands, who here thinks they'll start a company someday? Okay, that's a couple, cool. This is something you can do or you can't, right? Turning down a $160,000 job offer with an 8-month-old and a wife that was going to quit her job is the scariest thing I've ever done in my life, and it took me 30 seconds to make the decision. I don't think about decisions like that. I didn't waffle for 2 weeks. I didn't compare offers. I just did exactly what I thought about doing. And I think if you've read the word blink, right, most people know exactly when faced with a choice, like what you think you're going to do in the first 3 seconds, that's what you're going to do. You know, a lot of human beings spend 3 weeks hemming and hawing, but what they thought they were going to do in the first 3 seconds, that's what they do, and I just tend to just do it. And last, I'm pretty smart. I'm not overly arrogant. I'm not overly modest, though. I'm sharp, and that's important in whatever you do. Okay, so design. I found this cool definition of design. Creation of a plan or convention for the construction of an object or system. This was the alternate definition on Wikipedia. So a couple of things struck me about this. Number one, if you search long enough on the internet, you can prove any premise, right? So I just had to Google a bunch to find a definition that fit my needs, but it was out there. This is where I get to problem solving, right? Design is solving a problem. Whether you're building a house and the problem is you've got to make 3 different stakeholders happy while meeting a budget, or it's designing a web page, or it's solving a company's problems. It's all about solving problems. And this is actually the biggest hurdle we have at Intrepid with getting young designers over, is understanding that they're not drawing pretty pictures, they're solving problems. I don't know if you guys have heard of this paradigm of useful, usable, desirable designs, but it's awesome. You should definitely go check it out. And basically what it means, and I'm not going to, you guys know way more than I know about design paradigms, but it says that things should be useful, right? You need to solve someone's problem. If you don't start there, if it's not useful, none of the other stuff matters. If it is useful, it should be usable, right? It should be intuitive, user experience. Think, this middle one is the UX. And then if it's usable, it should be desirable, right? Then you should make it pretty and great and viscerally attractive. But so many designers skip the first one. They jump right to the second two without thinking, like, am I actually solving a problem for some end user, right? And if I'm not, maybe I should go talk to the person employing me and say, why are we doing this? Like, if we're not solving someone's problem, I can do the best design in the world, and it's not going to matter. All right. Next. So again, this is what I meant. It's kind of discombobulated, but they're all good stuff. So mobile, which is kind of my life, I live and breathe mobile, has completely changed the world, right? So we go through, I think other people have written about this, we go through a paradigm shift in computing roughly once every 10 years, right? So in the early 80s, before any of us were born, other than your professor, we went from punch cards to mainframes, and people could actually program stuff. Right? And then the early 90s went from mainframes to PCs, and basically computers went from closets to businesses. Right? And then in the 2000s, 2 things kind of happened simultaneously. Computers went from offices to homes, and the internet was born. Right? And in 2010, computers went from homes to our pockets, and mobile was born. Right? And this was huge. The second thing that's interesting is this is a screenshot of a Google Images search for the word mobile. And I love little case studies like this. There's a ton of interesting stuff happening here, right? Number one, Google thinks that babies are a whole lot more important than phones, right? And it's actually really important, right? On a bunch of different levels. Like, moms spend a lot of money, and that's an important demographic to think about. But the fact that when you type in the word mobile, the first thing is a mobile. Second thing, no one cares about places anymore. Mobile, Alabama, nowhere. Right? You search mobile, doesn't even show up. Third, Google seems to think that BlackBerry is still relevant, which is, I mean it half as a joke and half seriously. Maybe they know something we don't. Like the fact that I search mobile and there are as many pictures of BlackBerries here, almost no pictures of Android phones, as many BlackBerries as iPhones, that's actually really interesting. Yeah, that's all I have on that slide. Sorry. Okay, next. I have a funny Steve Jobs story. A really great advisor of mine is this guy, Joe Crusoe. And by the way, if you ever want to start a company, step 1, build advisory board. Really, really important. You cannot do it alone. You need people who know stuff that you don't know. And knowing what you don't know, as Socrates says, is kind of what sets apart smart people from not so smart people. Knowing what you don't know. And advisory board's really important. But he told me this story about Steve Jobs. So he was the CEO of a company back in the, I want to say, late 90s during the Pixar stint. Not, in between Apple's and I'm doing Pixar. And this company that he was CEO of was a hardcore engineering company of some sort. They were building some kind of video processing software. And he said, I got to meet Steve Jobs. I got to meet Steve Jobs. Like, he can make the break for us. It's really important. So he pulled a bunch of strings, everything in the book, and got a direct intro to Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs, so he laid out their problem of whatever it was they need solved. That's irrelevant to the story. And Steve Jobs sent back a one-line email. And the one-line email was, send me the first screen of the software. Just want a screenshot of the first screen, right? And Joe knew he was in big trouble, right? Because this was an engineering product designed by engineers. They'd paid no mind to design. They weren't thinking about the end user. They didn't have time to change it, but they sent it along. And it was the last thing they ever heard. They never heard from him again, right? It's kind of an interesting story. You know, people, if you've read Steve Jobs' biography, like kind of an obsessed guy, kind of a crazy guy. He really was, to a fault, obsessed with the design, right? It's all that mattered to him. To the point where it didn't matter what the opportunity was. If the first thing that an end user saw wasn't useful, usable, and desirable, he didn't really want anything to do with it. All right. Intrepid, I already kind of talked about Intrepid. I should have put this earlier. We're 25, we fluctuate between 25 and 30 people. We've pretty much capped growth. We don't really want to get much bigger because, again, I don't want to get too deep into what it's like to run a company. But if you get much bigger than 30, you become a different company. You have to hire a director of HR and a counsel and just a bunch of functions that don't need to exist in a 25-person company. And then those functions scale all the way up to 100 people. These are kind of like design problems, though, right? You're designing a company. I actually think an enormous amount about the concept of designing a company, right? So I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I'll elaborate a little bit. So if I go above 35, I need a director of HR because there's simply too much HR for me to personally handle, and there are other high-value things I could be doing. Problem is, someone who spends 40 hours a week worrying about HR, they can scale up to 100 people if that's all they have to worry about. So you need one at 35, and you've got to plunk down $60,000 in overhead for a function that you don't need any more than $60,000 in overhead all the way up to 100 people, right? So when you think about designing your company, it's actually really important to know where you want to be in 3 to 4 years and whether, because we can't cross the threshold. We can't go above 35 or we can't stop to 100. And there's other reasons for that, but that's why we want to be a 25-person boutique high-end dev shop in Boston. We have seriously the coolest office in Boston. Not quite the coolest. Top 5 is fair to say. I think fair to say we have one of the top 5 offices in Boston. Check out intrepid-labs.com. I apologize for having a domain with a dash in it. It sucks, but that's what we've got. It's awesome. So again, and this was a design problem, which I talked about a little bit already, but I've got a 12-person company in 2011. We've outgrown the CIC, which CIC is amazing if you know much about it. If not, go Google it, because again, it's its own design study. You should go get a tour. You should think about how they've solved space problems for a lot of people. We grew out of CIC, and we realized that CIC is amazing for 1 to 5-person companies or high revenue, very high revenue, like law firms, accounting firms, et cetera, 5 to 20-person companies, right? Not good for anything else. You know, they've solved 2 people's very specific problems. So what we did is we started Intrepid Labs to solve rapidly scaling 5 to 25-person companies that have budgets but not big budgets. And we did a pretty darn good job of that, right? You should come get a tour of Intrepid. You should talk to me or Tong, who runs it. We are, I think, it's fair to say we're the best place to grow a company from 5 to 25 because we've completely optimized for that size. That's all we exist for. You get above 25, we're actually a bad place to start your company. You're going to stay at 5 forever, we're really expensive. But if you're growing from 5 to 25, you can't find a company that spent the time thinking about how do you design a solution for companies that are growing rapidly from 5 to 25. Okay, last random thing. So 2 things. I've got 2 bullets for this one. First, client feedback, and this is just for the designers in the room, but you have to ask for it. And it's a huge bummer sometimes, right? Because you're going to think you know the design better than your client. There's lots of reasons. The second reason it's painful is the #1 piece of design feedback, based on my experience, you'll get once you go out in the world and design. And this is anything, right? This is homes, websites, mobile apps, anything you're designing. The #1 piece of feedback you're going to get is, I can't put my finger on it, but I don't like it. And that's actually really useless feedback, right? It doesn't help you iterate and get to a good solution at all, right? So learning to interpret, like your professor gives you great feedback. They help you drive towards that end solution. One of the biggest things most young designers, in my experience, have a difficult time learning is how to interpret, I don't like it, and ask the correct follow-up questions to drive towards what's actually, like, what should I do to improve it? Likewise, when you're, and we have a problem with this in our design team, the number one thing we have to combat within our own team is never give the feedback to another, I don't like it, right? It's useless, it's painful. Tell them something they can do, something that is tangible that will help them get to the end goal. Next, a story. So we had a client where, and we have pretty high rates, so we got paid $25,000 to do like 3 design iterations and write a technical spec. So it's quite a bit of money. And we came into the first meeting, and there's a bunch of like lessons learned here. We came into the meeting with 2 designs, one done by an intern that was basically making their bad wireframes pretty, and one done by a senior designer that was awesome, right? I should have brought the screenshots. I think I could have shown them to you. But it was way better. It solved the end user's problems way better. Now, we made a bunch of mistakes in this meeting. Number one, the intern was a legitimately better presenter than the senior designer. She was more charismatic. She had blue hair, which the client kind of liked. And she convinced, she knew that she was the bad design. Like, you go into a lot of these meetings like a realtor, right? You show them 2 bad houses and then a great house, and that makes the great house look even better. You don't do that on purpose with design, but you always have designs that you know aren't as good, so you lead with those. You try to be fair, you give them justice, but we messed everything up, right? So we had the good one go first. We had the better presenter, second story, always have the same person present both designs because you have all this presentation risk otherwise. So we had the better presenter go second with the worst design, and the client is raving happy. They love us. They're a reference client. And we did them a disservice because we kind of let them choose a flatly inferior design because it regurgitated kind of their built-in expectations. It was their wireframes that we just copied, right? And we didn't do a good job of explaining how the second design or the first design solved their problems, right? So lots of little interesting things in there that hopefully you can take away. And then the last slide, that's all. It's a really good quote. It's from Freakonomics. And I'm all done.
Well, this is absolutely great, and I like very much the zooming out to a larger sense of design from the narrower one about. And these slides do look a lot better, by the way. If you hand them off to a graphic designer, they do look better. But it might be fruitful to ask ourselves why. And why? It's because you were getting at the whole question of being a good designer is about asking the right question and solving the right problem. And I agree with you completely that being a good designer and being a good problem solver are mostly overlapping, if not synonymous, enterprises. The slides, what do they do? They make even a disparate a presentation that's touching on several different things seem like it's more of a whole. Seriously, in other words, since I saw the sort of notes for this in a way, what value did the graphic designer that you handed this off to provide? Making a common context for the different, quite disparate points that you were going to make. But I think in other words, what was the problem? I have a series of points that are not part of a single narrative, let's say. But what does design do? It creates a context for you. So just even in terms of your own presentation, I think that's really cool. Well, I mean, there's a number of things that we can talk about. One of them is the whole space issue, and that's one of particular interest to me as an architect. But I think that maybe we should start with the whole, I mean, I love, actually, for me, the presentation was a great backdrop for a conversation about what makes someone an entrepreneur. And so I guess maybe my first question is, did you get into the mobile app world because that's what you always wanted to do? Or is the mobile app world simply the first area, you always wanted to be an entrepreneur and you always wanted to be sort of an inventor, a creator of companies, and this was just the first opportunity to do so?
Yeah, so mobile was, in the beginning, was a complete mistake. Honestly, even being an entrepreneur to some extent was a mistake. I think with 2020 hindsight, I now know it was somewhat inevitable. I first went to law school as a replacement for an MBA. Right? I wanted to get a graduate degree. I felt that that was important. To get into a top 20 MBA program, you have to work for 2 to 5 years. I could get into a top 20 law program without working for 2 to 5 years, so I did that. And I had this hypothesis that I can do whatever I could do with an MBA with a JD, which was 50% correct. Like, I have friends who went on to work at McKinsey, and I have friends who got a job at Goldman. So, you know, it's harder, but you can kind of go do the sorts of things that you normally assume or what high net worth individuals do with a JD or with an MBA. What happened from there was almost accidental, right? I didn't mean to start Burning Hollow. I didn't mean to write a business plan. There was this like I think the first moment I realized it was real is when I went to a business plan competition and I won $25,000. And I was like, holy cow, like I can do this now. But it wasn't a conscious decision. You know, mobile was even more of a mistake, right? When we started Intrepid, the App Store was 1 year old, right? I think it was 1 year. The iPhone came out in 2008, the App Store came out in 2009, or might have been 2 years old. The point was, no one was spending money on mobile, no one knew what mobile was. Like, we were in, if you equate to the web, we were in 97, not 99. And I happened to have a guy that had written iPhone apps. And we needed a consulting gig, so I went looking for an iPhone app, because I'm like, well, we know how to write that. At least one of my 2 guys do. I bet the other guy can learn. It wasn't until mid-2011, when we had 6 or 7 people, that we put a stake in the ground and we said, we don't do web, we don't do print, we don't do anything but mobile. Like, I made a bet. I had enough information at that point to make a bet that mobile was the future. And it totally is. Like, if you guys aren't following stats on this, mobile is the future, right? 50% of all media consumption in the US is happening through mobile. It's just nuts, right? Netflix on your iPad is like 20% of the internet. All the internet, Netflix on iPads, right? It's happening way faster than the web did with Google. It's happening way faster than any of the past transitions. So we were smart, but we weren't visionaries.
Well, one of the things you just said, I couldn't agree with more. The importance of stating clearly and early what you're not doing.
Yeah.
I mean, I imagine that is not second nature to everybody. In other words, doing more things, even for highly, ambitious and accomplished young people, doing more things is better. I always got more credit when I did the extra thing. But teasing out that which you're not going to do, so that you can really focus on being really good at something, that sounds like a very, I'm not surprised that bore fruit for you.
Yeah.
So what was your very first app that you guys designed?
The very first app we did, we didn't design it. We actually didn't get into design till this, like, halfway through Intrepid's life.
So maybe explain a little bit about what that, because I am probably not alone in not knowing much about that field from the maker's end.
Yep, so we got started like so many small dev shops do, which is to say we subcontracted for agencies, right? So a lot of consulting firms in general in this space, you have a core competency, and agencies do everything. So our first contract was for an agency called Aperion. They're a company here in Boston. They've raised a lot of money. They're a startup, kind of. I mean, they've raised like $40 million from Kleiner Perkins. And they had a lot of big clients, right? They had a consulting arm, and they had Newsday, which is a biggest newspaper on Long Island, and they had AAA, and they had QuickBooks and the Jockey Club. They had all these big clients, and they needed to do mobile dev. And they did the design in-house, but they made a decision to subcontract all the development, kept their risk down. So our first app was an app for Newsday called Explore Long Island. It was a big app, and maybe more info than you wanted, but we quoted $93,000, which at the time was like the biggest money number I had ever seen. And over the life of the project, we lost about $150,000 on it, right, through not knowing what we didn't know. And it was a wonderful learning experience. But the first app we ever did was Explore Long Island. The second app we did was also for Aperion, was for AAA, and our quote was $60,000, and we only lost maybe 50 on that. And then we started to get pretty good at making money.
Well, it's interesting. So when you say the developers, you're the people who are writing the code.
Writing the
and
code.
The designers are the people who are doing the user interface.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yep, and you can go download them. AAA is okay. XLI is not very good. The design, we've stopped since we don't work with other agencies' design teams anymore.
So now you do a soup to nuts
Yeah.
thing. So you do the look and feel
Yes.
and the under the hood business for these apps.
Yep.
So I have so many questions on that front, but precisely as you say, mobile is it's exploding in this room right now while we're having this conversation.
Yep.
And it is the way that people get so many things. I mean, I was thinking about, as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about, I made a dinner reservation using OpenTable the other night on my phone.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm of course at the very, as you have adroitly pointed out, at the tail end of the age curve on this, on this space. But even I am doing lots of things with airline travel, with
Yep.
reservations and all the rest. What do you, and of course, media, watching movies and that sort of thing. What are the other things that people are going to be doing on mobile phones, do you think, that they're not doing now?
So I think, and this is kind of, I'll kind of take this question direction I want to go with it. Kind of thinking through macro trends, the last 4 or 5 years have been all about consumer mobile, right? And the really, there was a lot of kind of porting stuff from the web to mobile, right? So watching movies, that's not that transformative. Reading email, writing email, this is just stuff that we did before and now it's a little more mobile, right? But in the consumer land, we also have some really cool things that just weren't possible before, right? Uber is amazing. The fact that I can pull a phone out of my pocket, see where all the cabs are, call one, and get to where I want to go when I want to be there, it's incredible. We had a client called Joist that is basically putting a handyman or any contracting company with less than 10 employees, their entire toolkit to run their whole business on an iPad, right? And for them, that's transformative. The ability to write up an invoice, order supplies, take payment via Square. Square is its own transformative thing, right? So in the context of consumer mobile, things like payments, Square, Uber, Lyft, which is similar to Uber, right? These are game changers. I think going forward, where we're about to see a bunch of game changers is in education, healthcare, enterprise. Those are the 3 big verticals for us right now, right? We're helping a big healthcare client right now move all of their architecture from 2 places, pen and paper and netbooks, to Android tablets, right? And this solves so many problems for them, right? It solves the transcription problem, right? A nurse, it's a company that provides in-home care to people. So they got 2,000 nurses around the country. So a nurse, the way it used to work is a nurse would go to someone's home with a netbook and pen and paper, right? So they would take a bunch of notes in the pen and paper, and then they would go find internet, and they would transcribe those notes. And then they would download a virus, and then they may or may not look at stuff on the internet that they shouldn't be looking at, right? So they've got all these problems, right? Transcription stinks, super time consuming, they can't read their own handwriting, their netbooks get viruses, right? And we take all of that and we put it on a tablet. And now they could still have a stylus, but it's actually quicker if they just, we're building into this thing, they talk and it transcribes because that's gotten so good now. Right. And in one stroke, we can lock down that device so that they can't get viruses and they can't look at things they're not supposed to. We can move all their forms onto it, and now suddenly they're a big data company, right? Because the minute, so the joy of real-time mobile for this company is, and you combine this with big data, which is another huge trend that you should at least flirt with, become somewhat familiar with big data. The joy of big data is, so the nurse is putting into this Android tablet, Aunt Susie's blood pressure is X and her weight is Y, and she felt a little dizzy yesterday. And before she's had time to leave, like big data churns up in the cloud and says, you know what, you can't see the pattern. But based on the other 50, 100 million, right, 100,000 to 1 million times we've done this with other patients, the combination of slightly low blood pressure, gaining 2 pounds, and being dizzy in the last week, she's going to have a heart attack in the next 24 hours, right? And no human ever would have picked that up. But as soon as you get that data out of the house instantly and up to big data and then back down to the tablet, you can predict this stuff.
Wow.
So I think mobile is going to dramatically change healthcare education. And when I say enterprise, it's kind of like mobilizing the workforce, right? So apps that don't live in the App Store, but they live, you know, on all Procter & Gamble employees' phones, right? So you got 100,000 people using some suite of apps that enables them to be more efficient as a workforce. That's a big part of the future and what we're going to be doing.
Well, I think, you know, amidst all the stuff that's in the newspapers these days, it's easy to lose sight of how gigantic the transformation in this healthcare space is going to be, whether you're talking about from the technology standpoint, which is huge, from the change in public policy standpoint, which is huge and still very complicated, but we're actually working with CVS now to help them come up with new prototypes for urban healthcare delivery in precisely the environments that there has not really been primary care before.
Have you guys, have you seen the company PillPack?
I've heard of it, no, but I don't, I mean, I've heard that somebody in one of these meetings mentioned that.
You guys have got to check out PillPack. Can I tell you a little bit about PillPack?
Sure.
So PillPack was a Techstars company. They're amazing, right? So they were started by an IDEO designer, an IDEO designer and a third generation pharmacist, right? And they got together and they said, what was great about pharmacies 30 years ago, right? And what was great was is you knew all the clients and you could like deliver this really personalized care. And that's all gone, right? It's all Rite Aid and CVS and it's all broken. And PillPack, they've tried to reimagine the pharmacy from the ground up. Like, so rip apart everything you know about the pharmacy and let's redesign the pharmacy, right? So their reimagination of the pharmacy, and you can go on the website and find this, is you punch in everything you're supposed to be taking. Somehow, I don't know, I'm sure that they've innovated around how you get your prescriptions to the pharmacy, but I don't know that piece of what they're doing. What I do know is what shows up on your doorstep is not a little orange bottle with tiny type that no one understands. It's a box. It's a pretty big box. And the box has a spool of packets. And what comes out of the spool, the first thing out of the spool is Monday morning. You rip that off. And there's giant letters, right? And it says, take the pink ones with milk. Take the orange ones on an empty stomach. And that's it, right? Big giant letters, just like the pharmacist 30 years ago used to do for his elderly clients. He used to like draw big letters on the things and have handwritten sheets of paper and color-coded stuff, and that's exactly what they do. And you rip that off and you take those pills, and the next thing that pops out is Monday afternoon. Next pops out is Tuesday morning. And it's exactly what you should be taking. And they're going to be coupling that with mobile for reordering and a bunch of other things. But super cool company, all about how do we redesign something that we've been doing the same way for 30 years, and it's not good anymore.
Well, you know, we've been using 8 words in this course to kind of serve as kind of the let's say, the thing that creates a common context for people who do lots of different things in their lives. And, you know, one of those words is context, one of them is question, and one of them is iteration and so forth. But the idea of empathy, of understanding the world from the perspective of the consumer or the user or whoever the person is on the other side of the creative process, it really can't be overstated. I loved in your presentation the thing about getting consumer feedback or getting customer feedback. It may not be pleasant. Believe me, as an architect, I don't know. I mean, I haven't been practicing regularly for almost a decade, but the amount of different ways you can get beat up as an architect is really, it's almost limitless. You know, ours is one of the only fields where people ask you, you know, my wife and I are looking to redesign our kitchen. We're looking for something that's tall yet short, wide yet narrow, and before you know it, you're into that netherworld from which there is no escape.
Yep.
But the idea of understanding the consumer experience from their perspective, and the idea, I'm an elderly person, I got to take all these meds. If you ever, it is true, if you ever talk to an older person who's got a lot of stuff, they're angry about how confusing it is.
Yeah.
And their doctor's worried because there's so many mistakes that can be made. But the idea, and so one of the things we're doing with CVS actually is, and I really need to see this, we actually had Chris, the director of design for Johnson & Johnson was my guest was my first guest last January. I'm blanking on his last name, but he's a great designer and talked entirely about packaging of medicines in this way, and indeed even designing the aisles where you purchase them, so that it prioritizes all this kind of information. But it's super important. Anyway, we're looking backward at old pharmacies, not so much for the interaction with the pharmacist, but for the presence of other things that made it more of a social event to be there. In other words, whether there was a soda fountain or there was something else that made going, it's not something to be scared of like going to the doctor.
Yep.
It's a fine thing. It's a pleasant thing. You'll enjoy doing it.
I have this vision of the movie It's a Wonderful Life, and the early scenes where he's a kid working in the pharmacy, and there's soda fountain, and you get ice cream. And
Right.
Yeah.
You can imagine getting kids to go there wasn't a chore.
Yep.
Well, first of all, in talking about innovation in the mobile space, in a way, unlike some of our other guests, you're in an area where there must be so much innovation all the time, it's hard to even sort of tease it out as though we're going to try to be innovators. Well, everybody, I assume, in mobile is trying to figure out a way to slay the dragon better than everybody else and solve the problems more effectively.
Yep.
So do you really think about, because there are some businesses that think about innovation as a very discrete activity. I imagine that's not true with you. I imagine that you guys are that's front and center all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, it's not front and center. It just, this is going to sound kind of cliche or maybe self-serving. It is all the time, right? We're not innovating, we're solving someone's problem, right? And the fact that a mobile device exists that didn't exist 3 years ago lets us solve it in a way that you just couldn't do 3 years ago, right? So we're not actively thinking about doing it in a different way, we're thinking about doing it in the best way, right? And just the way that solves the problem the best we can, which I think, again, if you kind of pull out of what we do and go back to what everyone is doing in Boston, we probably do look very innovative, but I don't think we really think of it that way. It really is just problem solving.
On that front, when you're thinking about mobile apps and creating and changing the technical capacity of a device to do certain things, for example, I'll betray my ignorance, but I remember that when the iPad 2 came out and it had a gyroscope in it, it allowed a whole layer of apps that were place-based very specifically to know where you were and even what you were pointing at.
Yep.
So that now we'll enter into my interest, so that the idea of, what do they call it? Simulated reality.
Augmented reality.
Augmented reality,
Yeah.
sorry. Augmented reality, for an architect or a designer of the built environment, the idea that I could be looking into this room and then look into this room through my iPad and see my projected idea for what it would be. And I could show that to you, and you'd be sitting here and you'd say, oh my gosh, it's like you've put a lens over reality itself.
Yep.
And so that was a very powerful underlying technology that made some additional apps and performance possible that simply wasn't possible with a previous device.
Yeah.
So here's my question, because I think this is really interesting from a business standpoint. And I'm sure I'm tremendously oversimplifying, but so I have a mobile device, a phone, that we still call a phone, and maybe at some point we'll just start calling it mobile devices or this computer in my pocket or whatever it is.
Yep.
But it has certain capacities that I can advertise so that you, as a consumer, will buy it when I advertise it on television. It can look cool, it can come in different colors, it can maybe have some new functions, it has a better camera, it has other things like this. But there's another layer to this new phone, which is the underlying infrastructure that allows you to, now you're not the customer, now you're the app designer, to create a whole new suite of apps that was never possible before. But it's kind of hard for me to advertise that as Samsung or as Apple because they don't exist yet. So I guess what I'm getting at is it's an interesting design problem. How much of a new phone can be the infrastructure for things to come later, which have costs associated with them, and then how much of a new phone is the directly usable consumer things that I can appreciate the day I take it out of the box. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think this was a much bigger problem in 2007, 2008.
Okay.
Right, so in 2007, 2008, I think it might be 2007, let's say 2008. The App Store, so the iPhone came out in 2007, right? So we've got this brand new device, right? And there is no App Store, right? There wasn't supposed to be an App Store. There wasn't an SDK, there wasn't an API, there was none of that. Right, there was a calculator app that Apple engineers had written and a contacts app that Apple engineers had written. And there was apparently a big internal debate about whether there should be an app store. Right, so in 2008, the App Store comes out. And there was another, like, are people going to play games on this? And they're like, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't do any game APIs, right? Turns out that the iPhone, iPod Touch, iOS is, I don't know the number, let's say 30%. I could be off by a lot. 30% market share of all mobile gaming. Right, in 3 or 4 years. It's just nuts, right? So the biggest mistake they could have made was not allow games, right? So in the early days, I don't think anyone knew that apps were going to be big, right? Apple changed its rhetoric almost instantly, right? In 2009, the whole series of commercials, there's an app for that came out, right? And they started, dumping gobs and gobs of money into better tools, better tooling, better design layout tools. In fact, the one thing that Apple has way ahead of Google right now is the tools to build great stuff. Right? If you wonder why Android apps kind of stink and iOS apps are kind of awesome, it's the tooling. Google just right now, and this is changing, makes it difficult to build great stuff. Whereas Apple is constantly reinvesting. WWDC, the Worldwide Developers Conference, that big keynote that crashes and sells out, right? You show that to a consumer and they're bored out of their mind. They're announcing new APIs, right? But it's like this rock star conference to everyone else. My CTO sat in the audience this year, right? And he had to get in line at, 9 p.m. the night before the conference to get in to be one of the first people to see the new APIs. And that's the under the cover stuff. That's exactly what you're talking about, right? So I think we're in an arms race now where Android and iOS, they get it. Like they get the future of their success is their ability to enable developers. They've given up on everything else. They're not going to have their own apps. They know that the platform is going to rely on what the developers can do with it. So I think we're past the point where that's a problem.
That's interesting.
And also the cost for hardware has just plummeted. Right. I can talk more about that if it comes up, but it's not that much of a cost to them to add a gyroscope anymore. And they know it's their only, like it's the only thing about, the hardware is a commodity. Everything in that phone is a commodity, right? The thing that's not a commodity is the fact, Apple has a whole category now only on iOS, right? And I know from personal experience, they pressure iOS developers to not port stuff to Android, right? So the software is what's not a commodity. And the developers themselves, the people capable of building great stuff, are the things that are not a commodity.
Well, it's worth pointing out to folks in the audience that because people are majoring in all kinds of different things, but this distinction between a commodity and a highly valued asset, or I don't actually know the generic business term for that thing that isn't a commodity. But that difference has grown ever more important, it seems to me, in the last decade. Branded content, branded things. Look at the effort that Shell Oil Company goes to tell you that their 93 octane gasoline is not a commodity. It's, I think it is. It's not. No. Our gasoline is completely different from other people's gasoline. But but more successfully, the price differential that Apple enjoyed for 2 decades in selling computers generated from design as the thing that made them not the commodity where you could get it just a Dell was as good as an HP, was as good as a whatever. Now all of those companies, of course, have tried to retrofit their lines so that they escape. The one thing they don't want to be is a commodity because it's very hard to profit in a commodity market. I just offer that as background because I know it's second nature to you, but it's a crucial distinction in business, it seems to me. And you know, in the architecture world, one of the challenges in our field is that we are at the other end of the spectrum, the completely one-off. So much of architecture is premised on the idea that I will design you a single custom house that will meet you and your family's needs in a unique way and is not generic. And you'll say, yeah, I've arrived. I've got my own completely unique house. But of course, unfortunately, since it's not scalable, if I could then sell 5,000 of those houses, the time and energy I put into the customization of your house might actually become a very profitable enterprise. That's why moving into more prototypical, scalable things is where I think my field is definitely going to go.
Yeah.
Because it has to. I mean, that's where greater social benefit will accrue from that as well.
Yep.
So that's a good segue into the labs,
Sure.
into the Intrepid Labs, which, again, I don't think, we should expand a little bit on the difference between, I mean, you cited a number of very interesting drivers in the shaping of our commercial real estate environment. They're big forces that have to do with how people finance real estate and how the people who sell it are rewarded. And I think it was very, very clear that you can't borrow the money to build a big office building unless you have secured a number of big, large, like Fortune 500 type tenants who are taking, or at least big law, in this town, big law firms or people that take 20 floors of a big building. What you guys have done, as far as I can see, and I have not been to your space, I've been to the CIC space, but not to yours, is said, we'll be that big company in the marketplace, so that we know that we can't change the Leggett and McCall, the large commercial real estate dynamics. But what we can do is serve as the intermediary who rents a big space that is the kind a law firm would rent. Yep. And so we're satisfying their need for a long-term thing, and then providing me with space that I can sublease from you that comes not only at a size that I like, but with amenities that are keyed to a 5 to 25 person business.
Yep.
I think that's really interesting. What do you think, especially, I mean, that in a way might be the biggest innovation I've been to the Cambridge Innovation Center, and it is fantastic. For those of you who haven't been there, a fellow named Tim Rowe, and probably others, but Tim is the one I know, has put together a space that is all about young, small startup companies being right next to each other, sharing some common areas, and benefiting perhaps from the competition and joint energy of the place, rather than being isolated somewhere off in a loft by themselves where it might not have those other benefits. How is what you're doing similar to that, and how is it different?
Sure. So let me add a little bit more color to the kind of founding of Intrepid Labs. Mm-hmm. So again, I'll step a little further back in the story because I think it's interesting. So it's May of 2011, and Intrepid Pursuits is 6 full-time people and 6 interns. Mm-hmm. And we're in, so CIC has a couple different products. One of them is C3, which is their co-working space, which is it's a big open 10,000 square foot room with 1 to 5 person companies working, and it's like a hotel. It's like not a hotel. It's like a quiet Starbucks is kind of the vibe, right? And
long tables.
Long tables.
And
yep.
2 or 3 companies might be sharing a long table.
Yep. And there's no monitors. You don't get to leave anything behind. There's no assigned seats. It really is like a coffee shop. Mm-hmm. And upstairs, or right around the corner, all over the place, is their other product, which is dedicated offices. Mm-hmm. And it's gorgeous. It's tier 1 office space. It looks just like a law firm. Their co-working space is $350 per person and per month. And their tier 1 space with walls is $1,000 per person per month.
Oh, that's how it's priced per person.
Per person.
Interesting.
It's actually, it kind of averages out. It's actually priced as rent for the office plus a service fee per head. Right. And for their fancy space, if you work it all out, you can get spaces there for $700 a desk, and a lot of it's up to $1,000. Nice. So $700 to $1,000 a head. Okay. So we we were the first company to ever grow in C3, the co-working space, above 6 people. And we did it like that. We went from 6 to 12. And suddenly, we were 10% of the whole space. Because they only had 5,000, I think at that time, they only had about 5,000 square feet. And we were taking up 10% of it. And one of the guys at CIC called me in, and he said, Mark, and this is great, we wanted this to happen, you've broken the C3 model. Right? C3 is not meant to have 12 people, and most of them engineers. C3 is meant to have 1 to 3 person companies where entrepreneurs are in and out all the time, and they double sell all the desks. So if they've got 50 chairs, they can sell 100 because it's a coffee shop. You're not in there 24/7. And we broke it. So he said, look, I'm going to move you into a real office, and we're going to keep charging you $350 a head till we can figure out what to do with you. And that was in May. So fast forward to like September, and he calls me in and he says, we still don't have anything to do with you. I'm going to have to raise your rent soon because we're getting this $700 product for $350 a head. I mean, it's thousands of dollars a month they're basically giving us. They're subsidizing. So he said, you got to move out or you've got to be ready to pay real rent by, let's say, November. You know, and I cannot, they were amazing, right? They were so good with us. They gave us way more than we deserved, kind of because we helped them understand their own design problem. So we started looking for an office in September. And I toured a bunch of offices. And again, I'm a 12-person. So now fast forward again, and 3 of the interns stayed. I hired 3 more people. Now we're 12 people 6 months later. And we think we're going to be 25 by the end of next year, but we're not really sure. So we start touring offices. We do the whole big commercial real estate thing. And it's terrible, right? It's like the worst experience of your life. Because first of all, you're doing something totally non-core. Right? You're looking for office space. I'm a CEO of a rapidly growing company, and all the things I could be doing, I'm touring office spaces with some realtor that is just not someone I would want to have a beer with. Right? So, and then there's all these hidden costs. You need a printer, and you need internet access, and what happens if the internet goes down? And like, do I get a Cisco router? Do I get an Apple base station, consumer grade stuff? There's all these problems. So I look in this building called the American Twine Building, which is at 222 3rd Street in Cambridge. And it's amazing startup karma. It's all brick and beam, 25-foot ceilings, all 4 floors. It's awesome. Like just a really cool building. And I say, show me all the offices because I love this building. And there's 2 of them that are like 1,500 square feet. And he said, there's one up of the whole 4th floor is for lease, but you can't take it. It's 11,000 square feet. I said, why don't you show it to me? And I fell in love with it. I'm not joking. I absolutely fell in love. There's these colored floor tiles everywhere, and it's brick and beam with skylights and windows everywhere, conference rooms all along one wall. It's a 6,500 square foot bullpen with a kitchen and a roof deck, and in the middle of Kendall Square. And I absolutely fell in love with it. So I kid you not, I went home, and I'm not joking. I told my wife, I said, I'm going to lease that floor. I said, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to figure it out. I want to grow my company there. So I asked the realtor for an intro to the landlord, and I find out that the building is owned by a company called Transatlantic Real Estate Corp. And by the way, quick segue, like this is, when I said I'm good at problem solving, I'm really good at problem solving, right? I mean, this is what I do, and this is why I'm good at what I do. So I get an intro to Transatlantic Real Estate Corp. I do some research. I find out that there's a patriarch of a family that owns 80% of Transatlantic Real Estate Corp. And he's got an office in the building. So I get an intro to him. And I say, I don't know if you've seen that guy Tim Rowe, but he's making a boatload of money on CIC. Have you thought about co-working? And he said, yeah, we're actually really interested in this trend. And I said, I'm going to write a business plan this weekend. I want to rent your whole 4th floor. That honestly, anyone that can afford it is going to ruin it. Like they're going to chop it up into crappy offices because it's too big to do anything but co-working with. And it had been a co-working space. It had been Dogpatch Labs. You guys are familiar with Dogpatch? It's an incubator in Boston, and they had moved out and had been vacant for 10 months. So I said, look, I'm going to need a lot of help, but I'm going to write a business plan, and I want to take that whole floor. And he bit. He said, okay, and I showed him the business plan, and he liked it. He gave us a bunch of free rent. And then like, okay, now we've got 11,000 square foot floor, but we have no furniture and no money, and that was a big problem. And we got Turnstone, which is a really cool company to sponsor us and give us a bunch of furniture on really great terms. And we moved in with bad furniture at first, and eventually did that deal. We moved in with 12 people into 11,000 square feet. And we started thinking, at that point, we had all of this knowledge that we had built from living at the CIC, and all of this knowledge that we had built from doing our own office search. And we sat down to build a model of how do we solve all the problems that face 5 to 25 person companies. And we systematically did just that. right? So really good conference room scheduling and office hours from mentors and investors and good coffee, like really good coffee, fresh fruit in every day. So we kind of built this bundle of services that solved all of the little problems that companies have. And that is what Intrepid Labs became. And I've honestly forgotten your question.
No. It's about innovating. It's so funny that you guys are innovating not only in the mobile app world, but in the sort of creative placemaking for innovation world, which I think is so interesting because that leads us into another, I think, portion of this conversation, which builds on our outstanding visit last time from Kent Larson of MIT, who's just blew my skull in. I mean, he's the greatest. He's fantastic. And he's doing. I told you he's doing this collapsible city car thing that if we like Uber, and I'm a big fan of Uber too, but oh my God, that's just the beginning. I mean, it's soon these little robo cars are just going to drive up and you're going to get in, and then when you get where you're going, you just get out and it knows its own way home.
Yeah.
So that's really great. But we talked about the sharing economy. There was a cover story on The Economist, I think, that he shared with us, but we've seen it other places as well. That one of the things all of these apps do for us now is they make owning things it's far less obvious that we're going to own a whole,
Lawnmower.
All these things. As soon as you start thinking this way, you go, Jesus, half of what I have, I don't need to have.
And if you shared it with 10 people, you could have a better one.
I'm paying to store it for the 99% of the time when I'm not using it.
Yep.
I'm the one who's responsible if it doesn't start the 1 or 2 times a year that I need to use it. And there's more and more of this kind of stuff. And sure, cars are the sort of low-hanging fruit, but there will be so many other things. Are you guys involved with sort of? You might be so busy solving the problems of your clients that you don't have a kind of think tank wing, but
we do actually. That's what Timber came out of. So I'll give 2 kind of partial answers. One is actually that's probably not relevant. Never mind. I'll give one answer. My answer is a business plan idea. Actually, so I think about this kind of stuff constantly, right? I'm obsessed with innovation, right, and what the future holds. So I'm going to give a business plan idea to anyone in the audience. I'm not going to have time to act on this one, but it's a really good idea, right? So I'm a homeowner, right? I live in Wayland. I have a fairly nice house right now, and being a homeowner kind of sucks, right? There's a ton of stuff that breaks all the time that I have no idea how to fix. Handymen and contractors of any kind are untrustworthy, difficult to have a relationship with. They don't have email. There's so many problems in owning a home, it's unbelievable. So the idea is to share a handyman, right? So if I've got 20 homes, 50 homes in a neighborhood, right, in Wayland, and all of us spend about the same amount of money having our home fixed up every year. This doesn't count if you have a brand spanking new home, but if you have anything more than 10 or 15 years old, stuff is breaking all the time. So
in New England, we're mostly older housing stock.
So the idea is to create, and this is more of a technology play and a little bit of a human capital play, but to create a really amazing platform where a handyman can sign up. And you get mostly younger guys for this. And what my vision is, I've got this software platform where myself and my 49 other homeowners that live within 1 square mile, we basically buy a handyman. And we pay, and handyman is someone that can repair a window, recaulk a bathtub, change a light bulb, fix a roofing shingle, this wide range of stuff that 100 years ago I would know how to do, and now, thank the Lord, I don't have to know how to do, right? So we share him, and he gets 60 grand a year, 75 grand a year, maybe more than he makes now doing odd jobs. $75,000 a year plus some stability, knows exactly, plus $25,000 for materials. He spends Monday through Thursday with a different homeowner, and I've got my week. Like, I know that my week is the 4th week in October, right? And my wife and I compile this list, and he shows up on Monday morning, and I hand him the list, and I say, this is all the crap that we would have spent 4 years not fixing, right? Here, extra money, I need my hot water heater replaced, take care of it, right? Here's an extra $1,500, go get it, go find it, go price it, go do everything, and hand it all over. Every one of the homeowners would spend less money. The handyman would have less overhead, way less worrying about when the next job is. And because of that, he gets to charge effectively $30 an hour instead of $80, because that built-in price difference is what is all of his risk and not knowing what his next job is and having to worry about finding a job, right? And it's all through a really nice self-serve platform where all you need is either a homeowner to spearhead their neighborhood or a handyman to spearhead a neighborhood.
Right.
People would freaking love this,
Yeah,
right? But it's into that sharing economy. It's the mobile and the internet is going to make things so much more like you couldn't do this 30 years ago.
Right.
You need an admin full time for each handyman. Now your phone is the admin.
Right. Well, when you phrase it like that, that's a great way for people to think about what is the next problem to solve. Because I think one of the things that we've gleaned from this course, I would say already, is that, creating something, designing something, is almost always about identifying a problem that somebody didn't know they had. When you have a client, I loved your story about the bad communication with a client. There's other kinds of bad. I worked at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill early in my career, one of the sort of global leaders in architecture at the international scale, and we had very precise protocols for making presentations. Like the conference room had to be full of drawings, no matter what. So so you just want bigger drawings. This was in the era of hand drawing too. So oh no, they're having it in the big conference room. Oh no, that's like 40 square feet of wall space I got to deal with. But the other one was never, and now for this kind of business, never ever present something that you don't want to see built. Because we're talking slightly about two different kinds of presentation challenges, but in a world where there actually are multiple ways to do it, and early in an architecture project, there really are major different directions you can take. Just make sure you don't put something up there just to cover wall space. Those were the competing forces. On the one hand, I wanted to put up every idea I had because they'd given me so much real estate to cover. And on the other hand, never ever, I would be forever culpable if a client chose the wrong one.
Yeah.
But the issue about finding the right problem to solve, it seems to me, is in some ways it's one of the secrets to thinking like a designer, at least from my perspective. If you look at the world, instead of what was I asked to do, if you look at the world, maybe the person asking me to do the thing, this does not apply to your college professor, by the way. When your college professor asks you to do something, you have to do exactly what he asks. But when your client says, Mark, we want to hire you guys to do X for us, in some ways the highest value added response you can give them is, well, that's really, we're very appreciative that you want to do business with us. But I don't think that's the problem you need solved. This is there's a problem farther up the food chain or one in a different space. This is actually a symptom. Here's the problem over here, and if you solve this, you can solve it maybe all across your business or all across your enterprise. So I think, for the students, that's such a huge takeaway, because our educational system is actually, and especially, I should say, to the engineers in the audience, our educational system is unfortunately biased towards having students only respond to the problem as offered, as opposed to, and I will say something that may sound self-serving from our standpoint, which is, I think architects are like some other kinds of designers or other kinds of creative people who are actually asked to help frame what the problem is.
Yep.
You know what I mean? You might, George, we've got a piece of land. It could be a lot of different things, but we're not really sure. Maybe you can help us think about what that could be. It's great to be involved in a project early on in the sort of the problem setting stage like that. And I wonder if you think that more and more companies are actually going in the direction of some of America's biggest companies towards becoming as effectively as much consulting companies as they are anything else. Like if you think about IBM going from a hardware manufacturer almost exclusively to being a business consulting company, the solutions that they suggest often involve computing. Does that does that kind of reframing of, maybe that's just built into your world, maybe at the space you're at in mobile, everything you do is a kind of consulting. But would you say that's true?
I think what you're describing is what we call strategy versus implementation, right? So we as a company, as our reputation has risen, we've got more and more companies coming to us. Well, let me step back actually. When I meet with a new client, I say, look, there are one of 4 points in time in which someone engages with Intrepid. And I actually think there are massive parallels between architecture and software. In fact, if you want a book idea, if you want to write a book, I think, and I actually don't know if this person's name is like a swear word in a place like this or a holy word, but if you could reimagine the Fountainhead and Howard Rourke and take it out of architecture and put him in a world of building software, that's a great book right there. But
from my perspective, how many of you have read Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead? You know, Ayn Rand is the well-known.
That kills me.
You want it to be a larger number?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've read it. I've even read Atlas Shrugged.
As have I.
But I will say I read it in a different era when
they were a political statement.
but they were a political statement about a referendum on the Russian Revolution, not perhaps a projective idea about American healthcare. But be that as it may, what's interesting about the Fountainhead as it relates to the contemporary practice of architecture is that it's about a really heroic, hyper-individual kind of character who slays the world around a bunch of slothful collectivists.
Well, I mean, what strikes me about Howard Rourke is he's an extreme. He's not real, right? He's an extreme that no one could ever be.
Right.
And he doesn't compromise. Like he's the opposite of I'll show you 6 ideas.
There's
only one idea.
Right.
And if you want that, then you get him. And if you don't want that, you don't. And that's it. There is no, I'm going to cover every wall. He's the complete opposite of that.
Right.
But the reason I brought him up is, I don't know why I brought him up. I think I just had to bring him up.
Well, no. I mean, I understand. I mean, look, there's an attraction to. I mean, it's interesting. These sort of archetypes are interesting to us because, anybody who's ever been involved in the world of compromise and committees and process and what's the book you want to read? the Fountainhead, because I want, at least in my fantasy life, I want somebody who is taking names and getting stuff done, right?
I think Howard Rourke in the Fountainhead I think Steve Jobs is kind of the closest individual in modern society you could find to someone where there is no compromises, right? There are no, if you haven't read Steve Jobs' biography,
you really should.
You really ought to read it. And it was his way or the highway. He was living in a world where he distorted reality and there was just nothing else.
Right.
But what I was getting at is people kind of engage Intrepid at one of 4 points in time, and the older we get, the better reputation we get, it gets earlier and earlier, right? So in the early days, people came to us with a spec.
For execution.
Like here's the design, here's the system architecture, there's even probably a software architect. It's all done, just have 3 developers make it. We were practically India. Right? I don't mean to be disparaging. We think a lot about Indian developers, and we were competing with India, right? Because you can hand it to Intrepid and they're close to home, or you can hand it off to India and it'll be a little less. You get a little further back in the process, and the software architecture isn't done, and maybe there's wireframes, right? And they're like, we know what problem we're solving. Here are the wireframes. Make them pretty. Fool with the UX a little bit, but make them pretty, and then execute, right? And you go a little further back and say, look, we know exactly what problem we're solving. We haven't even started the wireframing process, but we want to build an app that does X, right? And now the thing that we're doing more and more of, and probably like 10% of my revenue will come from it this year, is what we call strategy engagement. So someone comes to us, and these are the only sorts of things Howard Rourke would have even accepted. Someone comes to us and says, this is what our business does. We don't even know what the problems are, right? We know mobile can help us. We know it's the future. Help us think of what app we ought to build, design it, architect it, and build it, right? And we're getting more and more into that. It's a lot of fun. Like we get to identify and solve problems and design them all the way out. So I would say like more and more of my revenue is shifting kind of further left in the spectrum.
Well, I think that's really cool because, of course, the whole idea about moving design what I would call design, or, for me, design, problem solving, strategic thinking are all in the same basket of things. And what you're talking about is moving up the food chain of an idea to its genesis rather than just the execution of it. And I think the more folks understand that there is that line, and that be mindful of where you are on it, and that the higher value, you will be compensated more for sure if you can add strategic value that will translate into a major change in direction, much more than you will for a slightly more efficient.
Strategy is where the money is.
Yeah. Well,
For sure.
it really is. And I think, design is such a central part of strategy, not just for Steve Jobs, but of course, out at Stanford, there are a lot of business schools now that are having design as part of their business education, which, when I went to architecture school, that would never have happened. That would have been like, I don't know, having medicine be part of your business education. It would have just seemed weird. Like, no, you should choose one and then do that. But this integration is, I think, really, really happening. We're going to get ready to give our students a chance to ask a couple of questions here. But I wanted to get at one more thing for us. Some of our guests, not all of them, some of them I have asked, and you seem like a perfect person to ask this question. You have clearly got a kind of entrepreneurial gene in you that was there from the beginning. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that there was once a really sleepwalking, slothful, unable to get out of bed in the morning version of you, I think. I'm just going to speculate.
Safe to say.
Okay. But nevertheless, your education played a role in your upbringing. What was given what you know now, with the 20/20 hindsight, what was the most influential class you ever took?
Wish I'd had that question before we started. Let me think. Influential, like.
Well, here, let me help it out. I mean, it doesn't. I think many of us. I mean, for me, I won't. There's no point in stating the year, but my freshman year in college, I took an economics class. In Economics 101, never taken another economics class since, but it did more to help me understand the world at a moment when I was particularly receptive to that understanding. It would not have been previously, and maybe not for a few years later, but at that moment, it really, that single course, and by the way, I'm a professional architect, I've gone to a lot of I've been running an architecture school for a long time, but the course that had the biggest influence on me was an Economics 101 class. And I could tell you more about why, but.
Yeah, so for me, I think it would be, I'm going to give a half cop-out answer, right? So I think there were 3 classes, right? So the first was absolutely Economics 101, right? You go through this, in fact, I remember the problem, like if there was an influential moment within the influential class, it was when the teacher said, Michael Jordan could be the best lawnmower on the planet, and it still doesn't make sense for him to mow his lawn. Right? There's better use of his time and utilization of resources, right? And it's, I think understanding efficiencies is part of it, right? The flip side of that was one sociology class, right? And you might have already gleaned, like I'm not political in general, but I'm definitely, if you had to like peg me, I'm somewhere right of center. And having that kind of counterbalance of sociology and thinking through the problems from a different perspective was a really important counterbalance for me. And then the third was just a really amazing professor. Like I think a lot of people have this professor that they end up spending a bunch of time with and they think is just fantastic, and you go down his course schedule and you take every single class he's teaching, right? It does not matter what it is, right? You take that person's class. And for me it was war in ancient Rome, witches in literature, and I took an independent study with him senior year because I wanted to hang out with him more, right? So I think the combination of a really amazing individual, economics and sociology were probably the influential things for me.
I think that's great because, by the way, students are like everybody else. They want news they can use. They want if these interesting people I'm meeting in this course, if they all took certain sorts of things that really influenced them, maybe I'll think about taking some of those things. And I think that's not a terrible idea. Okay, but I have to ask the counterpoint to that, which is biggest waste of time course that you took while you were in college.
So
It's okay. Now these are being videotaped, but we can we can alter your voice. We can. Do
I'm
whatever.
gonna say something perhaps more. I'm gonna go off the reservation a little bit.
Okay.
On this one. The biggest waste of time was probably graduate school, honestly. And this is not something you'll hear from your parents. It's not something you'll hear from most professors. The best thing I got out of law school, honestly, was 2 years to start a company, 3 years to start a company, right? Where I didn't have the pressure of making money. I don't regret going to law school because I wouldn't be where I was today. You know, it's like I don't regret anything I've done. In retrospect, going to graduate school before you've spent time in the workforce, verifying the hypothesis that that graduate degree will prepare you for what you would like to do was a huge mistake, right? And I don't recommend anyone go straight from undergrad to law to any graduate school, right? And there's even worse things about law school, about unemployment rates and the percentage of people that come out with jobs and other things. But you don't actually know that you'll like doing the sorts of things that a graduate degree prepares you for until you go work and watch the people doing the things that graduate degree would prepare you for.
Of course, you're speaking to a very sympathetic audience here because at Northeastern, I think pretty much every one of these students will do at least one, if not 2 or 3 co-op jobs during their undergraduate years, which is, for all the reasons you just said, is just so beneficial. It's just enormously helpful. Okay, I want to ask our audience if we have any questions for Mr. Kasdorf. You all have got it. You're ready to start your own company.
I always say that either means I did the best job ever or the worst job ever. If no one's got questions.
Here we go. Come on up.
So you say you've designed like 50 to 75 apps or whatever. Is there any one that stands out in your mind that like this was the best success, this is the one I learned the most from? Like which one do you remember the most and why?
Okay, I'm going to give 2 apps. Definitely Timber, right? I mean, I cannot go download it. We were doing parallax before Apple was doing parallax. I think Timber because it was ours, right? So Timber is a 3-screen app that we spent $500,000 worth of billable hours building, right? We put the time of care and energy into every single decision that no client can ever spend, right? It's kind of a dream for designers and developers to have an infinity budget to do something very, very simple. Right, and we did a lot of user testing, and then we threw it at the App Store, and 10 days later, it was the featured app for the App Store for the iPhone 5 launch, right? So kind of all this love and care that we had put in was vindicated. I mean, if you don't know what Timber is, you open up Timber, and it automatically searches and creates a playlist of every band playing within 10 miles of where you're sitting at that moment, right? So you get this list, and you tap on one, and it starts playing their music, and you can buy a ticket to the show. Right? It really is awesome. The second one is we're finishing up an app right now for a company called OpenBay. And this wouldn't be categorized in the sharing economy space, but it's OpenBay is more peer-to-peer. It's creating a marketplace between people who have car trouble and mechanics, right? So you say, I've like my car, I think my carburetor's going, or I'm hearing this sound, and it shoots it out to 25 mechanics, and 5 of them submit bids. And then you pay right through the app and you go get your car taken care of.
Wow.
That's kind of cool. Yeah. And it's a Google Ventures company. So Google has a venture arm, and Google Ventures funded this company. And we finished the whole app, and and the CEO, who's an awesome guy, went to his partner at Google Ventures and said, so we're going to launch next Wednesday. And the guy said, did you do usability testing? And he said, no. And he said, well, then you're not launching next Wednesday. And Google gave him this playbook for a Google-run usability test. And I learned more from watching that, and we won't even let a client come to us anymore unless they buy one of these. So basically, we put up a Craigslist ad with a $100 prize and got 150 resumes, and then we sent them a questionnaire, and we got 30 that passed the test, and then we phone screened those 30 and got 6, and then they sat down across from us, and they had the phone in front of them with the camera pointing down, and we said, what was the last car service you had done? And they said, carburetor. They said, do it in OpenBay. And then you just zip your lips. You don't say a word, right? And you ask them to provide a stream of consciousness of what's happening. and where they're confused and what they don't get and where the messaging is off. And we learned more in 6 60-minute recorded interviews. It was just incredible. And I can't imagine submitting an app to the App Store again without doing one of these studies. And it's not that much work, but that's probably the most.
That's really interesting. I have to ask, because it seems like of the two that you cited, one was kind of, let's say, a labor of love.
Yeah.
We want to do this because it's like an architect designing his own house.
Yeah.
And then the other one, though, was a commercial, for like you were hired to do it.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, that's, boy, we could have a whole nother conversation about that division between, and by the way, it matters a lot in the academy for promotion and stuff, which is hilarious in some ways because it suggests that only ideas that came up that you thought of as identifying the problem are worthy of recognition. Whereas if you're solving a problem for somebody else, which is what designers do, I'm sorry, we can't take that really seriously. And this is among the many so-called externalities that exist in like the ecology of campus life. That's one that I find hilarious. That if it's solving someone's problem, I'm sorry, we really can't. Now, if it exists, it's like a positive reinforcement for things that are not problems that people actually have.
Yep.
I find that deeply hilarious. But,
Yep.
Other questions? Okay. Well,
I'm going to point out a problem that is solvable. Maybe I'm just being a smartass right now, but the act of making students walk up in front of everyone and ask the question at that mic probably have 1/3 the number of people asking questions because you dramatically increase the anxiety necessary.
No, it's true. It's true. And if we did a user analysis, by the way, we are going to be sending out a little survey about how the course is going, and I hope that you all will get back to us on it. But you're absolutely right. Perhaps I'm a bit of a sadist in this way because
you learn good stuff.
As an architect, I know that one of the things I learned most in architecture school was how to speak in public and how to persuade people, which I believe we're probably in agreement on.
Oh, yeah.
Very important. Please. Hi.
So I just got the app, and it's beautiful, but you already know that. So I'm going to recycle a question that I used a couple, I think like a week ago. What were some times where you had to either give up your vision and why?
Had to give up my vision.
Well, parts of it.
Like, I think she's asking about compromise and, working with, the variables of the realities of the marketplace, I suppose.
Like, for example, we were talking to Henrik Fisker, and he was saying that there were times when he had to give up parts of, like something would look amazing, but obviously you couldn't engineer it exactly.
Yep.
So, what were times where you...
Or it would cost too much.
Yeah.
So I have a weird perspective, and this is where, I don't actually design stuff, right? I don't work with, I do some of the strategy stuff, but I'm far less common than anyone who works in design actually doing. I'm not forced to compromise that often. In fact, I've made a lot of uncompromising decisions that have cost me a lot. I have a deep history of disagreements with professors that cost me bad grades and with internships that cost me potential jobs. So I'm trying to think about a moment in time where I went home upset that I had compromised. And it's disingenuous of me to say that I've never done it, but I don't do it very often and nothing comes to mind. Again, if I was designing our products, I know that I make my designers compromise all the time. I say, look, I know you know that you're right. But in the end, we can't be Howard Rourke, and the client's right. Right? If we show them all the best options and they still choose something subpar. So I force people to do it all the time. I have the luxury, the only thing I'm designing is my company, and I have the luxury of being completely uncompromising with my company. And in ways that I think are really amazing and at times somewhat detrimental. Getting a job at Intrepid is really, really hard. I've fired 5 people in the last 4 years. All 5 are some of the 5 hardest things I've ever done in my whole life. Every single time I've let someone go, I've given them a ton of severance and made 50 introductions and helped them find a job, and I think that's part of my not compromising. And but I don't have like a moment in time where I was like, I compromised there and I regretted it or something, because the only thing I'm designing is my company, and I don't compromise there.
Cool.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you
Cool.
so much.
Right?